The heat smothered the city like an iron fist, wringing the sweat even out of the passers-by in the shadows. At the corner of a busy street, near an old diner, a blackguard stopped. His poise, strict uniform, and confident gaze instantly attracted attention. But not all stares were neutral. One, particularly heavy, burned into his back like a hot sun. "Hey, you!" came a harsh voice from behind. The guardsman turned around. A policeman in a slightly battered uniform, his cap pulled down over his forehead and his face hard, was striding toward him as if he were hunting. His hand was already resting on his holster, though nothing threatening was going on around him. "Papers," he ordered, not even bothering to add, "please." The crowd held its breath. No one dared to interfere, but everyone realized that something was brewing. The guardsman, tall and trim, slowly pulled out his ID card, handed it to the policeman, and met his gaze calmly. That gaze was harder than steel. The policeman did not like it. "What are you? A hero?" he hissed, handing back the documents but not backing down. "I said, kneel down." The silence exploded like a fragmentation grenade. People froze. Someone hurriedly averted his eyes, pretending not to hear. Someone involuntarily stepped closer, drawn as if to a tragedy that was impossible not to watch. The guardsman inhaled slowly. He didn't move. His shoulders remained straight, his arms down at the seams, and only his eyes stared straight at the policeman, with a cold determination that spoke louder than any words. "Are you deaf?" The policeman stepped closer, almost close now, his face twisted with contempt. "I said, kneel down. Did you hear me?" The guardsman did not answer. Instead, he stepped forward, breaking the fuzzy line that separated words from action. The crowd gasped. There was a threat in the air. Something was about to happen, and no one was prepared for how it would end. The policeman slowly withdrew his baton. His eyes glittered with a mixture of rage and pleasure. He was clearly convinced that he was going to break this man right here on the street in front of everyone. But the policeman did not yet know that the man standing before him had long ago decided for himself one simple truth. It is better to die standing than to live on one's knees. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you hear our stories from, and have you ever had a situation in your life where you had to take a stand in the face of injustice? Your experience may inspire others. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new and exciting stories. And now we continue. The crowd around them began to thicken. Someone pulled out a cell phone and discreetly turned on the recording. But most dared not interfere. There was a tension in the air that could break at any second. The policeman, noticing the audience, felt a rush of gloating pleasure. This was his stage, his performance, and the guard standing in front of him was only a pawn in his game. "I told you to kneel," he repeated, his words slowly, as if he were addressing an uncomprehending child. Or, don't you understand human language? The guardsman stared straight at him, unmoving, not saying a word. That silence fueled the policeman's anger more than a shout or an objection. He took a step closer, and now their faces were only a few inches apart. "You think you're better than me?" he hissed. "You think your uniform means something? Your service? You're nothing. You should be grateful that I'm letting you stand here at all." The words, soaked with contempt, struck like a whip. The crowd whispered, some turned away, unable to bear the humiliation. But no one interfered. The people were like frozen figures, witnesses to the drama, but not participants. The policeman stepped back so his words could be better heard. He loved an audience. His gestures grew wider, his voice louder. These guys think they deserve something, but they forget their place. Let me remind you, here, knees, now. He waved his baton as if pointing to the ground in front of him. The crowd fell silent. Someone coughed, but the sound was drowned in the oppressive silence. The policeman savored this moment. He felt like he was in control, but he was becoming more insecure by the second, because the guardsman didn't even flinch. Ah, so we decided to play hero? The policeman glared. He raised his baton as if about to strike. You think the laws don't apply to you? I'll show you how we punish your kind. He said the word such with emphasis, stretching it out as if he were labeling it for all to see. Racism dripped from his words like poison. His tone was utterly demeaning, leaving no doubt. This was not just an ID check, it was a deliberate humiliation. But the guardsman did not move. He stood silent as a rock, staring straight into the eyes of his assailant. His face remained motionless, but there was something elusive in his eyes that confused the policeman. It wasn't fear or anger or pleading, it was power. I won't say it twice, the policeman bellowed, raising his baton higher. But he was wrong. He would have to be wrong many more times, because this man in front of him was willing to go further than anyone could imagine. The silence. It stretched like a taut string, ready to burst. The guard stood motionless, his face impenetrable, his eyes cold and focused. The policeman expected at least a hint of fear, an attempt to justify himself, a plea. But there was none of that. Instead, there was only this incorruptible silence. "Are you mocking me?" the policeman hissed, his face flushed with rage. He looked at the crowd expecting support, but met only appraising glances. Everyone was looking only at the guardsman. "You don't know who you're talking to," he shouted, swinging his baton so that it made circles in the air. "I am the law. I am the authority. You are nothing, and I'm going to make you admit it." His words grew louder and louder, but each shout only exposed the uncertainty. This silence, this calmness of the guard, was like a mirror that reflected the cop's weaknesses. He could feel his power melting away, his role as dominant predator slipping away from him. "What? Mute?" The policeman leaned closer, his voice quieter but angrier. "Or are you so stupid that you don't know when you're being asked? Shall I explain in your language?" He said the last words with a venomous grin, stretching them so that each one sounded like an insult. The crowd gasped. Some stepped back, sensing that the situation was about to spiral out of control. The guardsman raised his head slowly. It was a barely perceptible gesture, but there was something unspeakably powerful in it. He looked at the policeman as if he could see through him, saw his fears, his weaknesses, his vain attempts to appear strong. "Do you think that silence will accomplish anything?" The policeman, on the contrary, was losing his temper. He stepped even closer, now almost touching the guardsman. "I told you to kneel, and you will, even if I put you there myself." But his voice shook like a leaf in the wind. This man in front of him, the man who had remained silent, unmoving, unthreatened or humiliated, was too calm. This calm was frightening, almost unnatural. The policeman began to doubt whether he was really in control of the situation. "Listen, kid," he tried to change his tone, though his voice was still soaked with venom. "You don't know what you're doing. This could end badly for you." The guardsman was silent. The crowd kept their eyes on him. Some were whispering about how long he would last. Some hoped for a miracle. Some waited for disaster. But no one, absolutely no one, could guess what would happen next. The policeman felt his grip on the situation slipping away. This man's gaze, calm, confident, fearless, was stronger than any weapon he had. It wasn't just silence, it was a statement. It was a protest, and it was driving the cop crazy. The guardsman stood like an ancient statue, indestructible despite the storm around him. But inside him, this scene was already familiar, like an old broken record. Every word, every look, every attempt to humiliate, he had experienced it all before, in a distant past that would not let him go. His father's face came to mind, an old, haggard man with weary hands and a tired look in his eyes. In the evening, sitting at the table, he had told the young boy that there were people in this world who would not want to see him as a human being. Never give them what they want, he repeated over and over. They'll break you if you let them. Be as solid as the ground beneath your feet. But how could a boy be firm when the first time he learned about hate in school? Then, at the age of 9, when he was the only black student in the class, the teacher, noticing that he had raised his hand, didn't give him a word. She ignored him as if he were invisible. And then, during recess, a group of boys surrounded him, shoving and taunting him. "Do you even know why you're here?" said one of them, wrinkling his face. "You were brought here out of pity." Those words were like a red-hot iron that left scars on his soul. He didn't answer then. He just walked away, clenching his fist so hard that his nails left marks on his palms. The years went by, but the strokes continued. One day, when he was working in a supermarket, his boss called him into his office. There was money on the table that was missing from the cash register. "You do realize it looks to you," the chief said, not even trying to hide his suspicion. The guardsman recalled how that moment had been a test for him. He had proved his innocence, but the residue remained. Every time he was accused or looked at as if he was guilty beforehand, he grew stronger. Every humiliation, every wound turned into armor. The deepest wound, however, stayed with him after that night. They surrounded him, shoving and shouting insults. One of them even tried to tear off his patch, but he would not yield. He stood still until they retreated. This silence, this endurance, became his weapon, his way of showing that he was stronger than their hatred. And now he was standing here, facing another abuser. The policeman's words cut his ears like a rusty knife, but they could no longer hurt him the way they had before. All the wounds of the past had hardened his will to steel. His father was right. Be as solid as the ground beneath your feet. That was why he stood now, silent, unwavering, and stared at the man who was trying to break him. The policeman didn't realize that what he saw before him was not just a man. He saw a legacy of pain and strength and resistance. The policeman could no longer contain his rage. His face was burning with humiliation in front of the crowd. His pride, inflated by power, was crumbling before his eyes. And the longer the guardsman stood motionless, the greater his sense of his own insignificance grew. It was unbearable. "That's enough!" he shouted, breaking into a scream. His baton flew into the air like an extension of his rage. "You think you can humiliate me? You're nothing. You're nothing." The crowd froze. People did not move, did not breathe, afraid to miss even a moment of what was happening. The baton came down with force, but the guardsman made no attempt to dodge. He stood like a fortress wall, taking the blow on his shoulder. The sound of the blow echoed down the street. The policeman took a step back, stunned. He had expected a shout, a plea, anger, anything but this silent resistance. The guardsman slowly raised his eyes and looked at him. There was more than contempt in that gaze, a challenge, as if he were saying, "You can't break me." "Oh, is that so?" the policeman shouted, his voice beginning to break. He struck again, this time aiming for his chest. "You think you're above the law? You think your uniform means something?" The baton came down again and again on the guardsman. His body shuddered from the blows, but he did not make a sound. Each blow only strengthened his resolve. This was not just a fight. It was an act of resistance that said to everyone around him, "I will not submit, even if it costs me everything." "You want to be a hero?" the policeman yelled, his face twisted with anger. He grabbed the guardsman by the collar, pulled him closer. "You think I'm going to let you walk out of here victorious? No, I'll break you." He pushed him to the ground. The guardsman fell, but immediately rose, looking again into the eyes of his tormentor. That look was stronger than any words. It was a living reminder that the policeman was losing, despite his physical strength. "What? Too proud?" The policeman ripped off his badge, tossing it on the ground. "You don't even deserve it," the crowd began to whisper. Some onlookers turned away, unable to watch this injustice, but there were also those who took out their phones, recording what was happening, sensing that this was more than just a conflict. "You're not even human," the policeman hissed, leaning closer. His voice was quieter, but it was venomous. "You're just dirt under my feet, and now I'm going to show everyone where you belong." He grabbed the guard by the shoulders, trying to force him to his knees, but he resisted, not even using his hands. It was a battle of wills, and the policeman was losing everything in it. His face was red with tension, and his eyes were wild. His every movement was full of rage, humiliation, and hatred. But every silence of the guard sounded louder than all the insults the policeman could utter. "Get on your knees," he yelled one last time, his voice hoarse from screaming, "or I'll break you right here." But it was useless. The man in front of him was harder than granite, and every blow, every cry, only made him stronger. And the policeman understood that. That's what drove him crazy. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and have there been times in your life when you have faced injustice or prejudice? Your stories can be an encouragement to others. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. The crowd grew like an unaccustomed mass of shadows, gathered by the street noise and the hum of tension. The people were in no hurry to disperse. Their faces were full of contradictory emotions. Some looked frightened, others mesmerized, others gloatingly awaiting the climax. On the busy street, where life usually flowed, there was now an oppressive silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the policeman and the occasional whispers in the crowd. The crowd grew like an unaccustomed mass of shadows, gathered by the street noise and the hum of tension. The people were in no hurry to disperse. Their faces were full of contradictory emotions. Some looked frightened, others mesmerized, others gloatingly awaiting the climax. On the busy street, where life usually flowed, there was now an oppressive silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the policeman and the occasional whispers in the crowd. A woman with a child in a stroller stopped to the side, not daring to leave, but also unable to look. Her face expressed horror, as if she realized that she was witnessing something historic but terrible. The man in the suit holding the briefcase looked at what was happening and immediately looked away. He didn't want to be a part of it, but to walk away would be to admit that he was afraid. And he was afraid of too much, of the police, of public judgment, even of having his face accidentally caught on a tape that someone in the crowd was already sure to have on his phone. Two teenagers stood nearby, clearly amused by the situation. One of them snorted loudly, pointing at the guard. "Look, he actually thinks he can do something. Why, he's not even defending himself. What's he waiting for?" His friend nodded, smirking. "Maybe he likes being the victim. What's that thing they say? The world isn't fair? Well, here's an example." These words were heard by an older woman who was standing nearby. She turned to the teenagers and whispered sternly, "Shut up. You don't understand what's going on here. This isn't just a fight. This is... She stammered, unable to find the words. And how do you explain it when your heart is bursting with indignation, but fear holds you back? Meanwhile, the man with the phone was trying to keep the frame steady. His hands were shaking. He knew he was filming something important, that this footage could be proof. But he didn't feel like a hero. He didn't make a move to stop what was happening, even when the policeman grabbed the guard by the collar and pushed him again. The man with the phone could only stare as if paralyzed, convincing himself that at least he was recording the truth. But was it the truth? The policeman turned to the crowd, holding his baton in his hand like a trophy. His gaze traveled over the faces, and there was a challenge in it. No one dared to challenge him. No one took a step forward. He grinned. "See? That's their true color. They're all the same, standing there like sheep, not knowing where to put themselves when they are put in their place." These words caused a whisper in the crowd. Some squirmed, some frowned, but no one said out loud that it was too much. Racism was in the air, permeating every second of what was happening. At that time, the guardsman, rising again after another jolt, looked around the crowd. His face remained impassive, but his eyes seemed to turn to them all at once. It wasn't just a look, it was a challenge. "And are you standing too?" they seemed to ask. "Are you afraid too?" But no one answered. His gaze did not ask for help. It demanded something more: conscience, courage, humanity. But all he got was averted eyes and mumbling. A young couple, standing closer to the epicenter, were talking quietly. "We have to do something," the girl whispered, squeezing the boy's hand. "This can't go on like this." "And what are we going to do?" he snapped at her, trying to stay calm. "Do you want us to get beaten up too? It's the police. They do what they want." "But this isn't right," she insisted, her voice shaking. The boy rolled his eyes, trying not to look at her. He was afraid that her words would bring up a guilt he didn't know how to deal with. The policeman turned to the guardsman again. The crowd had quieted down. Not even whispers could be heard now. His hand rose with his baton, as if about to strike again. But this time he stopped. He was annoyed at the silence, at the passivity of the people around him. He wanted the crowd to cheer, to approve of his actions. But instead, he felt a growing tension, as if the whole city were looking at him with a judgmental eye. "What? Are you saying I'm wrong?" he shouted into the crowd. "This man deserves what's happening to him. You all know it. Say something. Somebody." But no one answered. Even the teenagers who had been laughing a moment ago now looked awkward. "Pansies," he muttered, but there was a growing panic in his voice. The guardsman rose again, slowly and confidently. His gaze slid over each face, and the crowd involuntarily drew back. He seemed to be looking straight into their souls, making them feel part of something wrong. And they were indeed part of it. Their silence screamed louder than any words. The policeman, seized with rage, stepped toward the guard, almost close. His breathing was heavy, as if he had just run a marathon. but his eyes burned with rage. He no longer saw the man in front of him. He was now a target, an object he must destroy to prove his power and authority. "For the last time," he gritted his teeth, "are you going to kneel, or do you want me to show you who's boss?" The words dripped venom like hot tar. Each one was soaked with hatred, as if all the anger and prejudice he'd accumulated over the years had found its outlet in this moment. He wanted submission, humiliation, for this man to break under the weight of his power. It wasn't just a demand. It was an act of power, a power that fed on fear, weakness, and submission. The guardsman raised his head, slowly and confidently, looking straight into the policeman's eyes. His gaze was calm, but in that calmness there was a steely determination. He spoke not a word, but his presence, his silence, was louder than any shout. The policeman waved his baton as if warning of what was about to happen. He shoved the guardsman, but he didn't even stagger. His back remained straight, his shoulders straight, and his gaze firm. This made the policeman even more furious. "Are you kidding me?" he yelled, his voice hoarse from the strain. "You think you're better than me? You think your uniform means something? You're nothing." The crowd around him froze. No one moved, no one breathed, as if this moment was frozen in time. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. And then the guardsman did something no one expected. He slowly lowered his hands to his belt, undid the buckle of his belt, and carefully removed it. He then removed the jacket of his uniform, folded it neatly, and placed it on the ground. It was an act that seemed to say, "You can take anything you want, but you won't break me." The policeman stared at him, stunned. This was not what he had expected. He wanted fear, he got defiance, he wanted humiliation, and got pride. The guardsman slowly straightened up, now out of uniform, but his posture remained just as firm. "You think I'm afraid of you?" The policeman stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "You think this will make you a hero?" The guardsman finally spoke. His voice was low, calm, but each sound was full of power, like a hammer hitting an anvil. "You can take off my uniform. You can try to break me, but you can never make me forget who I am, and you can never make me become who you want me to be." These words sounded like thunder. The crowd gasped. It wasn't just a response, it was a challenge to everything that was going on here. It was an answer not only to the policeman, but to anyone who had ever tried to humiliate him. The policeman lost his temper. He raised his baton, swinging it in such a way that it looked as if it would be the last blow. But before he could bring it down, the guardsman stepped forward, facing his tormentor. "You could hit me." His voice was hard as a rock. "But that would just show everyone who you really are." Those words were like a blade piercing the policeman's confidence. His hand froze in the air. The crowd began to whisper louder. Someone shouted, "Leave him alone!" The policeman turned around, looking at the crowd. The faces, which a moment ago had been indifferent or frightened, began to change. People looked at him not with approval, but with judgment. Some were holding the phone, others were looking directly at him, waiting to see what he would do next. "What? Are you all judges now?" the policeman shouted, waving his baton. "You think you can tell me what to do?" But his voice no longer sounded so confident. The guardsman stood before him, tall, calm, and that image began to shatter the remnants of his power. It wasn't just a man, it was a symbol that even in the deepest humiliation, pride could be preserved. The crowd began to move. People were no longer silent spectators. They took steps forward, their faces expressing determination. The policeman looked back, seeing the situation getting out of his control, and the guardsman, standing directly in front of him, uttered the last, "You thought you could break me, but you just showed everyone how weak you are." Those words were the final blow. The policeman, breathing heavily, took a step back. He realized that he had lost, but this realization was only beginning to catch up with him. The crowd, seeing the guardsman's strength and courage, could no longer remain indifferent. The crowd retreated like the sea before an impending storm. The policeman, breathing heavily, his face blackened, grasped the baton with both hands. His rage boiled like a volcano ready to erupt. He couldn't let anyone see him defeated. His power, his ego demanded retribution. "You think this is over?" he spat out, clutching the baton so hard his knuckles turned white. "You think you can stand up to me and just walk away?" The policeman took a sharp step forward, striking the ribs of the guard with his baton. The blow was strong, and the sound echoed through the square like the beat of a drum. The guardsman staggered, but did not fall. He straightened, jaw clenched, and met the policeman's gaze again. It made him even more furious. "You think you can stand in front of me like I'm nothing?" he shouted, his voice booming, making the people in the crowd flinch. "You're nothing, do you hear me? Nobody." He landed the next blow on the guardsman's shoulder, then another on his legs. But the guardsman stood. His face was stony, as if he had shut off the pain completely. The crowd was silent. Everyone watched the man take the blows one by one without uttering a sound. This silence was driving the policeman crazy. "Scream!" he shouted, swinging harder. "Scream like the men I always put in their place. Scream so they know who's in charge." But the guardsman did not make a sound. He stood as a symbol of everything the policeman hated: fortitude, strength, human dignity. The policeman stopped to catch his breath. His face glistened with sweat, his hands trembled with exertion. He felt his power slipping away, despite everything he had done. This was unacceptable. "So, you want to be a martyr?" he hissed, dropping the baton to the ground and snatching up the handcuffs. "All right, you'll be one, but not the way you think." He clamped the guardsman's hands behind his back, cuffing them so tightly that they cut into his skin. The metal sank painfully into his wrists, but the guardsman didn't let it show. The policeman pushed him to his knees, forcing him down by force. But even on the ground, the guardsman remained just as proud. It was not a posture of submission. It was an act of resistance. "Look at him," the policeman shouted, turning to the crowd. His voice broke with rage. "There he is, your hero, the freak who thought he could defy the law." But no one in the crowd laughed. No one cheered him on. People looked at the guardsman, and there was something new in their eyes. It was not pity, not fear. It was respect. The policeman felt it, and it made him even angrier. "Don't you dare respect him," he shouted, his voice growing more and more hysterical. "He's a criminal. He broke the rules. You all saw it." The crowd remained motionless. A few people took out their cell phones, filming what was happening. The policeman noticed this, and his rage turned to despair. He realized that his every move was being recorded, but now it was too late to stop. He grabbed the guardsman by the collar and dragged him to his car. The street was bursting with shouts of protest, but no one dared to intervene. People were afraid that if they got between the policeman and his victim, they would be next. "You think this is the end?" he hissed, pushing the guardsman onto the hood of the car. "I'll show you what it means to defy me." He searched his pockets, as if hoping to find something to justify his cruelty. When he found nothing, he angrily threw the guardsman's personal belongings to the ground. "You're nobody," he repeated like an incantation. "Just another problem I'll solve." But the guardsman stared straight ahead, not answering. Even now he refused to show weakness. His silence continued to erode the policeman's power. That silence screamed louder than any accusation. At that moment, the policeman, finally losing control, swung to strike him with his fist. But he stopped. The crowd was no longer silent. People began to shout words of encouragement to the guard. Their voices grew louder and louder, as if awakening something forgotten, a sense of justice, of courage. "Leave him alone," the woman closest to me shouted. "We see what you're doing," added someone from the crowd. The policeman realized that the situation was out of control. He let the guard go, but not out of mercy, out of fear of the consequences. His face twisted with anger and humiliation. He stepped back, but this was not the retreat of a victor. It was defeat. The guardsman rose, slowly but surely. His wrists ached, his body whimpered from the blows, but his spirit remained unshaken. He turned to the policeman without saying a word. His silence was the ultimate victory. The crowd erupted in applause and shouts. The policeman quickly stepped back, trying not to make eye contact with the people. He knew he had lost. The guardsman, however, stood among those who now saw him as more than just a man. He had become a symbol that even in the face of the fiercest pressure, dignity could win. The next morning, the street where the tragedy had played out looked as usual. People went about their business, cars hummed in traffic, and only the scattered belongings of the guardsman and the dried traces of blood on the pavement reminded them of the storm that had passed. But the event that had happened here had already begun to spread beyond this place like circles on the water. A video of the incident, shot by several eyewitnesses, went viral on social media. The footage showed a guard, beaten but proud, and a policeman who had lost control, shouting derogatory words that could not be interpreted as anything other than blatant racism. The images struck straight to the heart, evoking indignation and sympathy. News headlines screamed from the screens, broken but not conquered, how the guardsman became a symbol of resistance to injustice. Police brutality sparked a wave of protest, fighting for dignity, the Black Guardsman's fight against the system. The video reached major television stations. Journalists were looking for witnesses, trying to find out the name of the guard, and users in comments expressed their emotions ranging from rage to admiration. But fame brought more than just support. The confrontation generated a new wave of hatred. Threats appeared in the comments. People justified the actions of the policeman, claiming that the guard provoked him, that it was his own fault. Some wrote, "Knew where he was going. Shouldn't have been called." Activists quickly joined the fight. They organized a rally in support of the guardsman. A crowd gathered outside the police building, chanting, "Justice! Dignity! Stop the violence!" Placards with the guardsman's image, his face captured in a moment of silent resistance, became a symbol of the movement. People demanded an investigation, the resignation of a police officer, and some demanded a complete reform of the law enforcement system. Meanwhile, the policeman at the center of the scandal tried to justify himself. In an interview, he said that his actions were forced and that he acted within the law. But his words sounded hollow, especially against the backdrop of footage of him humiliating the guardsman and trying to break his spirit. Public opinion was quickly turning against him. The guardsman, on the other hand, ended up in the hospital. His body was mangled by the blows, his ribs cracked with every breath, but the worst was inside. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the policeman's voice, his taunts, his rage. Every humiliation, every blow came alive in his memory. He knew he would never forget that day. A lawyer, a representative of a major civil rights organization, came to his chamber. "You've become a symbol," he said, sitting down next to me. "People are talking about you, taken to the streets. We have a chance to make a difference, but only if you agree to keep fighting." The guardsman looked at him. There was no fear in his eyes, but there was weariness. "I didn't want to be a symbol," he replied. "I just wanted to be left alone." "I understand." The lawyer nodded. "But what you have done has already changed a lot of things. Now it's up to you to continue the fight or to back off." The guardsman remained silent. He knew that even if he agreed, the consequences would be dire. He had nothing left but his own dignity, but he couldn't let that be taken away either. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the situation was heating up. Opponents of the activists also began to gather, shouting their slogans. Their posters contained insults and caricatures, which boiled down to one thing: know your place. One of the groups even tried to break into the hospital to make it clear that he is not a hero. They were stopped by the police, but this only increased the tension. The police department issued a statement that an internal investigation was underway. This only caused more outrage, as many saw it as an attempt to keep the case quiet. But the activists did not give up. They demanded an open trial, punishment of the police officer, and an admission of systematic problems. The guardsman himself eventually agreed to be interviewed. His voice was weak, but every word sounded firm. "It wasn't about me," he said. "It was about all of us. Those who are forced to live with their heads down, those who are afraid to speak. I wasn't standing there for me. I was standing there for them." Those words went viral, sparking a wave of new support. But for the guardsman, this fight was personal. He knew that even if he won, his life would never be the same. He lost his anonymity, became a target for hatred and a symbol to fight against. His principles were now his cross. The room where he lay was quiet. Outside the window, people were shouting his name, but he stared at the ceiling, remembering the face of the policeman. In that face, he saw all that he had overcome and all that was yet to come. The fight for justice grew into more than just a case of a police officer assaulting a guardsman. It became a symbol of systemic injustice that was talked about by everyone from TV news anchors to teenagers on social media. People argued, shouted, outraged. Activists demanded change, politicians argued about rights and laws, and the police department tried to salvage its reputation. The guardsman became a name everyone knew. His face, with stern features and deep eyes full of determination, became an integral part of protest posters. His silent resistance on that sidewalk inspired thousands, but for him it was both a blessing and a curse. After he got out of the hospital, his life became a challenge. He could no longer walk down the street without people stopping him. Some approached him to express gratitude, others to express hatred. Threats appeared in his mailbox, envelopes with crude insults, pictures with sights on his face, hate notes. His phone was ringing off the hook, and social media was a veritable storm. He was praised and cursed in equal measure. The police announced that the policeman who beat him had been suspended, but this caused even more outrage. People demanded a trial, but the system resisted as best it could. Senior officials said the policeman's actions, while not perfect, were within the bounds of procedure. This phrase became a new symbol of cynicism and injustice. The policeman himself appeared on the news to justify himself. His face was full of anger and resentment. He spoke of a difficult job, of having to make decisions in stressful situations. He even tried to make himself look like a victim. "I'm not the one who made the mistake," he said. "It was society that threw me under the bus." These words provoked even more anger. Crowds took to the streets again, chanting, "No excuses, no excuses." Guardsman, meanwhile, found himself embroiled in a never-ending war. Lawyers, reporters, activists, his own friends, all pulled him in different directions. Each saw him not as a person, but as a symbol. He was asked to speak at rallies, to appear in documentaries, to give interviews, to tell his story over and over again. But every time he spoke of that day, he felt his soul returning to those blows, to those words that wounded more deeply than a truncheon. He realized that his life was no longer his own. His face was on T-shirts. His name was in speeches. His story was used as an example of resilience. But no one asked how he himself felt. No one saw him wake up in the night in a cold sweat, hearing a policeman's voice in his head, "You're nobody." Activists organized a march that brought together thousands of people. People carried candles, sang songs, and repeated the words that the Guardsman said in his interview, "It's about us all." It was a powerful sight. Cameras captured the faces of children holding placards bearing his name, old people walking with difficulty but confidence, young people shouting slogans. But the Guardsman himself didn't come. He watched the whole thing on TV, sitting in a dark room, feeling a strange mixture of pride and heaviness. He knew he had done the right thing. But he also knew that the price for it was too high. The next day, the news came. The policeman had resigned. It was a small victory, but it made no difference to the Guardsman. He realized that this battle was bigger than one man or one incident. It was a war against a system that had been in place for centuries, and he had become a soldier of it, not by choice. Weeks passed, months passed, history began to fade, as it often does. People found new reasons to protest, new symbols to fight. The Guardsman's name was still heard, but less and less often. He himself remained in the shadows, trying to find the strength to move on. But every time he passed the mirror, he saw a face that had become a symbol of something greater. And that face no longer belonged to him. One evening, he went out to the street where his story began. The corner was the same as it had been then, noisy, with cars and passers-by. He stood there for a few minutes, watching people. No one recognized him. No one looked at him. He was part of the crowd, as he had once wanted to be. But inside he knew he would never be the same again. This story was not about victory or defeat. It was a story about courage that leaves marks, not only on the body, but also on the soul. Write in the comments what you think about this story. What feelings did it evoke in you? Have you ever experienced racism, injustice, or prejudice in your life? Tell us how you dealt with these situations. Perhaps your experience will be an encouragement to others, because these conversations help us to understand each other better and to strive for change together. We are truly grateful to each of you for listening and sharing your thoughts. Your comments and support inspire us to create new stories that make us think, experience, and discuss important topics. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episodes. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a like. That way, we know we're moving in the right direction. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a good day and the strength to stay true to yourself in any situation.